Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Sacramento Public Library and Authors Uncovered. We are absolutely thrilled. It's a week from the less than a week from the election, and we are thrilled that Ellis Cose is here to talk about his latest book, The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America. Those of you who are familiar with Mr. Cose know that he's the author of several books, including The Rage of the Privileged Class, a bestseller. He's a former contributing editor for Newsweek magazine, and his writing has appeared in the Chicago Sun-Times, Time Magazine, USA Today, The Washington Post, and the New York Daily News, among other publications. The library loves events like this, and we love being able to bring together authors and readers, which all of you are, and an amazing interviewer, which Donna Apidone is, as those of us who are in her fan club know. And we think it's really special because especially in this time of COVID, being able to present these virtual programs and bring you best-selling authors from everywhere in the land is very special to us. So as we navigate this ever-changing world, please know the library is here for you. Right now, if you have not yet mailed in your ballot and you want to drop it off in a safe and secure location, 26 of 28 of our libraries are accepting ballots Tuesdays through Saturdays from 10 a.m. until 6 p.m. We also have 11 libraries that are vote centers beginning this weekend on Saturday. We will all be open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. on Tuesday, Election Day. So stop by the library, pick up your books using curbside, and drop your ballot off. It's easy, it's secure, and we're thrilled to be a partner with the County Elections Department, as we have been for the last 6 years. So think about that. If you need more information, you can call 916-331-VOTE. And you can learn all about voting. Of course, the county elections office has information, but the library set up a special phone number in case you need additional help. We want to be there for you, and we want to help you. We want everybody to vote. It's important. And we want to give you a few housekeeping items. So if you have questions for Mr. Cose, please put them in the chat. We've got a couple of people standing by, putting them into a document that makes it easy for us to ask questions at the end of the program. So tonight's program also will be live streamed on Facebook, and you'll find us at SAC Library on Facebook and at SAC Lib, L-I-B, on Twitter and Instagram. There's a recording of tonight that will be available later this week on our website. If you've not yet read the book, you can pick up a signed copy from our official bookseller partner for this event, Face in a Book, and they will mail it to you. And I believe Mr. Cose sent us signed book plates, so it's even a signed copy. It's as close as we can get to the real experience of having an author, which you know is one of the favorite things that we do at Sacramento Public Library. Also want to thank the Friends of Sacramento Public Library, our official fundraising partner, who are with us every day in every way, helping us bring services and programs to you, whether it's genealogy programs, Book First, which provides the first book to own for many first graders in our county, and countless other events. So I want to make sure you know about that. Of course, you all know Donna Apidone and how amazing she is, so I'll introduce her in a moment. But I also have to thank our partners at HarperCollins. Those folks are absolutely the best partners a library could ask for. We beg for authors, they send them. Donna does a great job interviewing them. You buy their books, and hopefully everybody's happy about that. that's what we're trying to do at Sacramento Public Library, is make sure that everybody has access to either authors they've known before or new authors they may not have experienced before. So please take the opportunity to listen to what I know is going to be a great interview. And I also want to mention that Sacramento Public Library, did I mention this? We're opening for browsing, limited browsing in several locations on November 5th. More information will be coming out about that, but you'll be able to go in and pick out your own books. And we're very excited about that as well. So I think we're going to actually start a couple minutes early, if that's okay with Donna and Mr. Cose. And
fine with me.
All right. And Donna, you have heard her absolutely soothing and warm voice most mornings on Capital Public Radio. She is the favorite voice I like to hear when I wake up in the morning, and does such a lovely job, and is a wonderful partner to Sacramento Public Library as we navigate these very interesting times. So thank you. And oh, I forgot to point out where the restrooms are. Look around you, and they must be somewhere in the vicinity of where you are right now. With no further ado, I'm going off screen, and I'd like to welcome Ellis Cose and Donna Apidone for what I know is going to be an amazing conversation. Thank you.
It will be an amazing conversation. Ellis Cose, thank you for being here. Welcome to Sacramento. You're sort of zooming in from New York City in very cold weather there, I understand. So I hope you feel...
It's rather rainy, but not so cold. But anyway, I'm delighted to be with you, Donna.
Good. I'm glad that you're here. You always write so many interesting topics, social justice topics, for lack of a better category, but topics that make us think about things that we hear about, things that we think we know about, and then you take it one step further. So we have a lot to talk about in this book about free speech. I want to go back a little bit, though. I found out a couple of interesting things about you. About you that I didn't know. For example, I just found out that one of your mentors very early in your life was a poet laureate. And I noticed in the first couple of pages of your book how immediately drawn in I was to the poetry of your writing. And now I understand it. Tell us about that.
Well, you'll be talking about Gwendolyn Brooks, who was an esteemed Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. And it's hard to tell you about why she came into my life without telling you about me in high school. So let me just take a second to say that when I was in high school, I decided that I was going to write this long essay on riots in America. And I decided to write this essay because my community, when I was a kid, was destroyed by riots, or at least was largely destroyed by riots. And so I became curious about this history of riots in this country and when they had happened, why they had happened, et cetera. And so even though I had, previous to that, not been terribly interested in English class, I actually thought I was going to be a mathematician at that point. I decided to write this long essay as opposed to doing the assignments the teacher wanted me to do. And she kindly agreed to let me write this long essay as opposed to doing their assignments. So the first time I got really, really excited about English, and ended up producing an essay which is roughly 140 pages long.
I bet your teacher was surprised.
So that's an understatement. I turned it in to my teacher. She took it home and read it over the weekend. And then she called me up after class and she said, Ellis, I'm going to give you an A, in this class, but I'm really not equipped to judge this material. You need to send it to a professional. And I said, and I was a kid, and will come up in the housing projects of Chicago. And I said, what do you mean send it to a professional? What do you mean? I don't know any professionals to send this to. And she said, well, have you ever heard of Gwendolyn Brooks? I said, well, yeah. I mean, she's the poet laureate of Illinois. She's won a Pulitzer. And she said, well, you should send it to her. I said, well, where is she? It turns out that she taught at a college in Chicago. And she said, well, send it to her at this college and maybe she'll give you a response. So I did, and didn't hear anything for several weeks, which I wasn't surprised by. I figured I didn't quite know what poet laureates did, but I figured they were probably busy. And then one day I get a call from Gwendolyn Brooks, and she says, you have to come over and talk to me. And I said, okay, well, where are you? And well, she happened that she was at a college called Northeastern, not the one in Boston, but the one in Chicago, which was 3 bus rides away from my home. So I went to this college, and there was a small, sort of shy woman, there. And she invited me into her office. And she had taken my, I guess for lack of a better word, my manuscript, and she had scrawled across it in both blue and red ink, one day you will be a great writer. And she handed it to me. And I'm, don't know what to say. I'm looking at it. I'm going, huh? Yeah. And she basically said to me, she says, look, kid, I don't know what you are planning to do with your life, but you have a gift for writing. That's what you ought to do. And so I later came to understand she did this with, many young people, though not necessarily as young as I was at the time. But she liked to take young writers and work with them. And so she invited me to join her writers group, and I attended that for a while, though I quickly decided that all these old people, the old people were 30 probably, were a little bit much for me, but we stayed in touch for years, and she was a huge influence in my life and was one of my sort of guiding lights back from the beginning.
What an opportunity. That's fabulous. And the other thing, I wanted you to give some sort of an answer before I brought up the next item, because when I met you earlier today as a radio person, the first thing I was taken with was your voice. Wow, what a great voice. Well, you know that, and a lot of other people know that because of radio work that you've done. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I did probably the most, important thing I've done in radio was I did a series several years ago called Against the Odds. And it was a look at people in various societies in various countries, India, Africa, the United States, of course, who had overcome tremendous obstacles and had accomplished something interesting with their lives. So it was aired on national public radio stations across the country, most of the top 100 stations. And it was a lot of fun, and so, yes, I have done at least some professional radio work.
Yeah. So this book, so you start with Charlottesville and remind us of what happened there with the Nazi wannabes, and you give us a lot of lessons about the founders and what their possible intentions were, or at least what we perceive their intentions to have been about freedom of press, about freedom of speech, and the relationship between the two. And then ultimately, you tell us a lot about Donald Trump, and we'll get to that eventually. But for starters, the topic. You find topics that we think have been exhausted, and you reissue them in new ways that we never would have imagined. How did you realize that you could do that? How did you realize you could reinvent this topic, freedom of speech, and make it fascinating all over again?
Well, I didn't necessarily realize that, but let me just give you a little bit of information. I mean, I was the inaugural writer in residence for the American Civil Liberties Union. And I served in that position for a couple of years. And the idea of when I joined the organization, and even though I was not quite a member of it, was separate from it, was that I was not necessarily charged with writing anything about the ACLU itself, but we had a shared interest in social justice and an interest of and issues of speech. And they said, well, wouldn't it be great if someone like you, were here and you could take advantage of our resources and the thinking that we have here and just do your own projects. And I said, that sounds like a great thing. So at the time, I was actually working on a book on criminal justice. And then eventually we get to the Trump candidacy and the ACLU taking a huge position in opposition to much of what Trump was doing. And that coincided with the director telling me that, Anthony Romero, letting me know that they had their 100th anniversary coming up, and it occurred to me it might actually be interesting to write a book about the ACLU and their history, which I did. So, and I actually stepped down from my position as writer in residence because I thought it was probably not proper for me to be writing a book about an organization that I was actually part of. So I stepped down from the ACLU in order to do that book, which came out earlier this year also. It's a book called Democracy If We Can Keep It. And my original, and you can't write about the ACLU without thinking a lot about free speech and how it evolved in America and what it means in America. And actually, originally, my thinking had been, this is a topic I need to really plunge into in order to write about the ACLU. And I might even do this as part of the book about the ACLU, and then made a couple of editorial judgments. I mean, one was that the book on the ACLU is a narrative history. This book, which is a book on free speech, is more of an extended essay. It's an exposition. And these are different animals. And there's also so much to say about this issue, independent of what the ACLU did and their history, that is worth a book all on its own. And I also happened to be, when I stepped down from the ACLU, one of the positions that I took was as a fellow at the University of California's Center on Free Speech and Public Engagement. And so one of the things that I did there was a lecture at the law school at UCLA. And that lecture actually became the template or the foundation, for this book. And it's an exploration of how we came to have this right in America, how it evolved in America, what it has actually meant in terms of society, and what it means now that it didn't used to mean. That in sort of a nutshell, is what my lecture tried to do, and what this book attempts to do.
Well, free speech is something that we learned very early on as part of what the founding fathers gave us, the Bill of Rights. But it wasn't really. I mean, you make the case that it's really a 20th century thing.
Yeah, Donna, and most people, as you say, they assume, okay, the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791. So we have had free speech ever since then, and it's been, just this relentless march of this right that we have always enjoyed as a society. And once you look at the issue with any depth at all, you understand that that's just not the case. I mean, yes, it was something that we accepted in 1791 as part of the Constitution, and obviously one of the First Amendment to the Constitution. But within a decade, and actually in 1798 with the Alien and Sedition Acts, we basically nullified the First Amendment. I mean, we made it illegal to speak out against the ruling party at the time. We put people in prison for publishing things critical of that. And so it was a right that we had on paper, but that we didn't really respect, and that was not really incorporated into the ethos of our society. And the other thing that most people just don't realize is that originally, as construed, the First Amendment was a restriction on the federal government. And if you read the text of the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law. Well, in Congress by implication, the rest of the federal government. It did not apply at all to the states. So states could do whatever they wanted to in regards to speech, and often did. And one of the examples that I find most interesting has to do with abolition. The southern states essentially outlawed criticism of slavery. And so if you are carrying abolitionist literature, you could actually be arrested. You could be flogged or beaten. If you published abolitionist thoughts, your newspaper could be destroyed. And that was perfectly okay as they saw it, because it took until the 20th century, and it evolved in a series of cases. The most famous one being in 2019, something called Abrams v. New York, where the Supreme Court decided that the First Amendment applied to states. But before 2019, before basically 100 years ago, it didn't apply to states at all. And it was an interesting case, like so many of these cases. I mean, they found it was a case having to do with literature that some guys were throwing out of their window, advocating sort of revolutionary thought as it was construed at the time. And this was a violation of the law, of state law. And so they were hauled into court and they were convicted, and they appealed this all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the court upheld the conviction. But it said, even though we're upholding this conviction, maybe this thing called the First Amendment should apply to the states too. And decided then by something called the incorporation doctrine, to incorporate the First Amendment into the states, to incorporate it via the 14th Amendment. But they basically said, okay, this applies to states now. And so little by little, we began to apply this concept of the First Amendment to the states. But the other thing I was just in with this, Donna, is that even at that time, the First Amendment didn't fully apply even to the federal government, because you had a number of instances where it was outlawed to have certain types of thinking, or not certain types of thinking, but to express certain ideas.
Yeah, there are a couple of cases that you bring up in California that the people here will probably be very familiar with, that I hope you can address for us. One is about conversion therapy, and the other one was about distributing information about abortion rights. And those seem to be, they may apply to other states, but the cases I understand were specifically about California. Is that correct?
Well, one of the cases was California. I think that was Florida. It was a Florida case.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, the argument basically was, could the federal government require birth control clinics or various clinics, to distribute information that had to do with that had to do with abortion and the harms that it could cause, et cetera. And also whether they could be required to force people to distribute literature that advise alternatives to abortion, and that could recommend both alternatives to abortion, but also abortion as an alternative to itself. I mean, that was the sort of set of issues that the Supreme Court had to make a decision about. And ultimately, there were an array of decisions, but essentially the court decided that these clinics could not be required to distribute certain types of information, that was a violation of the First Amendment. And so and the court came to a different sort of decision about conversion therapy, which was that it was okay for the state to rule against the outlaw the attempts to convert people from being gay to being straight, because it was not so much a First Amendment issue as a health issue, and that states could determine what was allowed for good health or not for good health. So you've had this mixing. I mean, and that's not unusual. You have this weighing of different rights and different sets of responsibilities, and if something does use speech, but it's also something having to do with health, can you regulate that? And I think that's the decision you're also talking about.
And that's what's so interesting about this book and the way you've put it together, because there are many, many court cases that you lay out for us that have to do with freedom of speech and freedom of the press, but not so much in the ways that we might think, or at least the way we thought when we were taking civics class, because everything does cross those lines, crosses lines into health, crosses other lines as well. There's one situation that you brought up that fascinated me in this year's election cycle, because it had to do with music by the OJs, great band, by the way, music that was used in a pro-Trump video. But it really got my attention because this year the OJs have a very pro-Biden video. So it's kind of struck me that they are making, or sort of fighting their way back on that case. But tell us, really making a statement probably related to what you're going to tell us about how that music in that video was used several years back.
I don't really write about the OJ case. I mean, I think that's a different case you're thinking of. So I'm not quite sure what you're referring to here.
You were talking about it's right at the beginning of the second chapter in The Root of All Evil, and just making the statement that the OJ's music,
which was okay. That's not okay. I thought you were talking about a legal case.
No, not a I'm sorry, I switched gears and I didn't put on my turn signal to let you know that
I know exactly. I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. That has to do with the introduction to The Apprentice, which was Trump's obviously the show that brought Trump to fame.
Right.
And it's the money song, and him using that, or not him using that. I mean, the producers of the
producers used
the TV program, which used that to make him a huge symbol of financial success, and that in no way obviously expressed an endorsement by the OJs of his politics, because at that point, his politics were not very well known. But it was more an endorsement of the image of him as this hugely successful multi-millionaire and possibly billionaire, depending upon what you believe, who was being portrayed as the guy who was this supreme master of the universe, and one of such an accomplished manager that celebrities went to him to learn how to be managers as well. But it's interesting, but the way that I use that is an introduction to a chapter about the role of money in politics. Because and as an introduction in a way to begin talking about the Citizens United Supreme Court decision from 2010. Which basically shredded the limits that have been put on corporate donations to political campaigns. But my apology for not getting that initially, because I thought you were talking about a specific court case. No.
Yeah, but tell us about Citizens United. Tell us about how that worked, how that came about, and what its effect has been since then.
Well, it really was a response to the election reform laws, to the McCain-Feingold Act, which put limits on what corporations could do when it came to supporting candidates, put limits on when they could advertise, how much they could advertise, what kind of coordination they could have. And the Supreme Court basically said, wait a minute, you're infringing on their free speech rights, and made a decision that some people, even at the time, thought was absurd. I mean, they essentially declared that corporations were persons, and as persons had the same rights that you as a person and I as a person have, when it comes to the First Amendment. And that in the same way, they could not tell me not to spend my money advocating on behalf of a candidate. It could not tell a corporation or a labor union as well how to spend their money when it came to advocating for a corporate, for a politician. And of course, people objected to this, including Justice Stevens himself, who said, wait a minute, this is crazy. Corporations aren't people in this sense. I mean, they don't die, they don't vote. They may even be owned by entities outside of the United States. So how can you say that corporations are people? But that was the decision the Supreme Court made, and it was one of the more unpopular decisions. But it opened the way to all kinds of dark money and just money in period flooding into politics, and in my view, eroded even more the voice of ordinary people, because there's no way that someone like I or you can compete with a corporation that has millions of dollars at its disposal, to spend on advocacy, on political advocacy, and it tilts democracy in a predictable and obvious direction.
It is a very good example and a very good way to explain how rich people's votes matter more than the votes of people who do not have the same amount of money.
Oh, sure.
And that really pointed it out.
And there's research on that, and I'm not that you need research. I mean, it's common sense. If you want to say, well, who is a politician going to be more responsive to? Is he going to be more responsive to somebody who's a voter in his district who has one vote, or is he going to be more responsive to somebody who's put, $10 million into a campaign on his or her behalf? And it's rather predictable. They're going to be more responsive to the person who's put several thousands of dollars into their campaign, whether or not that person actually lives in the district. And typically the person doesn't necessarily live in the district. They're just interested in a particular issue. So it takes away the influence on democracy that individuals and even constituents have and hands it to corporations that have their own interests.
I look forward every year to finding out what the words will be. What's the word of the year? And in 2015, a word came into the Oxford dictionaries that you point out, but we all know it from a few years ago anyway, the word post-truth.
Right.
And when the topic is free speech in America, the idea of post-truth, we heard it one way when that was presented several years ago, but in this context, it just kind of expounds on it. It just sort of expands the idea of truth and post-truth and the silliness of such a term. Do you see it as silly, or do you see it as impactful in some other way?
Well, the term itself, I don't think is silly. I think it's rather clever, but I think the phenomena is ridiculous. And if you look at sort of our evolution of thinking about the importance of free speech, it sort of flows directly from the ideas of Louis Brandeis and Oliver Wendell Holmes. And those ideas, which were inculcated in many court cases in the earlier part of the 20th century, basically articulate a philosophy. And they say, why do we have free speech? Well, we have free speech because words matter, and that ultimately that's the way we decide what's right, what's wrong, what's good policy, what's bad policy. And in this war of words, this war of differing truths, if you will, good ideas will ultimately drive out bad ideas, and truth will ultimately drive out lies. I mean, that sounds kind of naive, looked at from the vantage point of today, but it's part of the framework upon which the whole modern conception of free speech rests. And so we now have this era where our executive branch itself endorses a version of post-truth, that the truth is what they decide the truth is. It's not bound by any sort of objective reality. And we have been moving in that direction for a while, beginning at the very least with the political campaign of John Kerry in 2004, and the whole Swift voting incident, where a lie that was repeated loudly enough basically turned someone who was a war hero into the very opposite of that. And we saw it as well with the issue that, of course, was the foundation of Donald Trump's rise to political influence, which is the birtherism issue. Reached the point that by late in the election process in 2008, a majority of Republicans were convinced, or at least they told pollsters, that Barack Obama was a native of Kenya. And so we've seen this idea that there are no real facts, there's no real truth, there's just what politicians or other people of influence decide is truth. And it's a very corrosive concept, but it's become one that we have to deal with and wrestle with in a very clear way now.
In about 2 minutes, you just explained that it's a very naive fundamental concept all the way to there is no truth. That's kind of mind-blowing, in a certain way. That's kind of, you've taken us from one extreme to, you've taken us from kindergarten through graduate school somehow in a very short period of time. but it does open up the whole territory of political advertising, of how everything is being thrown at us, and we're so aware of that right now with just a few days before
Right.
this election ends. Where are the lines now? They've changed so much over the years, and probably Brandeis and Holmes were seeing some interesting changes in their times as well. Where do we stand now? Are you seeing anything that crosses the line, maybe not illegal, but crosses a line that surprises you in terms of freedom of speech in political advertising?
Well, I don't know if it's possible these days to be surprised because we've seen so many norms shattered, but there are certain things that seem alarming. I mean, I take issue with Zuckerberg, for instance, with his defense of why Facebook thought it was perfectly okay for them to run political advertising of blatantly, easily disprovable lies. And using the argument that this is in support of free speech and that free speech requires this. And I took issue with that for several reasons. I mean, one, he used the example of defending this, and he harks back to Sullivan v. New York, which was a landmark 1964 Supreme Court case having to do with a lawsuit brought against a bunch of ministers, a group of ministers who were aligned with Martin Luther King, excuse me, and the New York Times. And these ministers had taken out an advertisement in the New York Times, basically to garner support for the civil rights movement, to garner support for Dr. King. And they mentioned in the ad that Dr. King had been arrested a number of times. I believe they mentioned 8 times. And they also detailed what had happened to protesters protesting segregation in the South. Well, the sheriff in Alabama, the head of the chief of police, took exception to this, and he decided that this ad libeled him, as did other Alabama officials. And so he sued, won what was a record judgment at the time, which is $500,000, which essentially would have bankrupted these ministers and done grave damage to the rest of the New York Times. And there were several other suits pending. And the attempt by the officials in Alabama was clear. I mean, they wanted to stop the civil rights movement, and they wanted to punish the Yankee press that was covering the civil rights movement. So they brought this case. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ultimately said, wait a minute, this is ridiculous, and establish a standard where they had to be absolute malice in order for that. And absolute malice meant that they had to know something was untrue and prove it was and that they knew it was untrue and willingly wrote about it anyway. So Zuckerberg takes this case and says, see, this is the right that I'm defending. And he said, because there was this case about mistruths in the New York Times, in 64, and they said that you could print these, so I can print these mistruths now. And it's a misunderstanding, a willful misunderstanding. I mean, the mistruths he was talking about, or that the Supreme Court was referring to, were not mistruths at all. They were slight errors. I mean, instead of King being arrested 8 times, he had been arrested, I think, 7 times. But there were things like this that they got wrong, that had no material effect at all on the argument that they were making. And of course, the Supreme Court ruled that it was ridiculous. Whereas with these ads that the Trump campaign was taking, they were basically pointing towards some of these crazy conspiracy theories and outright lies and falsehoods. And Zuckerberg was saying, well, that's, this is the basis of the civil rights movement. So of course, this is right to print these things. And he was wrong on that. He was wrong on the law, but he was also wrong because no one was bringing a libel suit against these people, but even if they were, the question was about whether the state was in a position to regulate speech, not whether a private entity, could decide in at its discretion that it didn't want to print lies in its pages. So he conflated those two and confused those two. So the question of where we are, we're sort of in the Wild West. I mean, Facebook has changed its rules a little bit. And because of, I think, of all the uproar, and they've decided that certain ads can not air for the first time within a week of an election or so, and they've made some other minor revisions. And other platforms have decided they will issue corrections on certain things, or there are other things that they will not post because they violate their standards. But it's an evolving group of things that are happening. But what it highlights, is, first of all, I think the distinction between government regulation and private entity regulation, because these platforms are not government entities. And the government is not saying you can or you cannot print this. These are private entities which are saying that, and they have every right, to decide on their own that they're not going to have absolute falsehoods that are fostered on their platforms. They are deciding, in many cases, they don't want to do that because it cuts into their profits.
And here we are with some of those hearings taking place right now, and taking place just before an election that would have an impact on an election in a totally different way next time around, or would have last time around. So the timing is just so interesting. We're in a complex setting of media, social media right now. But I think if we go backwards and look at something a little bit more historic, it might simplify our view of the role of the press. Freedom of the press as part of freedom of speech, going back to the McCarthy era, and how the press handled some of that. We're not talking about necessarily about legal cases, but just in the practical sense of how media handled news about McCarthy and what he was doing. Did the media feed that negatively or positively? Were they fair? Were they not quite on? What happened?
That's an interesting question, Donna. And I think there was a controversy at the time. I mean, the Denver Post sort of stood out because the editor of the Denver Post said, "Wait a minute." Once the press became aware of what Senator McCarthy was doing, that essentially he was making up stuff. And accusing people of being communists, that one, there was no proof that they actually were, and then that he had no real investigative capabilities that had shown him what he was doing. That he was basically just, he was smearing people and libeling them. But of course, he could not be held responsible for libel because he would make these statements on the floor of the Senate, which was a protected space constitutionally. So he could libel. So what would be libel if you or I did it was not libelous for him. So he was just unfairly accusing people of belonging to an organization that and ruining reputations and ruining lives. And so the editor of the Denver Post said, "Wait a minute, we need to allow people the right to respond to this, and we need to label what he's doing, as lies." And he adopted a policy that if McCarthy accused somebody, then they were going to allow that person a chance to respond. And if he said something they knew was untrue, and if they decided to run with it, they were going to say that it was untrue. But he got a lot of resistance among other owners of the press to doing this. They just didn't think it was their job to do this. So by and large, the press, I think, did not behave terribly responsibly back then. And it's interesting you go back to that era because you have that question that's being raised again around Trump.
I was hoping we might make that connection because it's pretty clear. And by the way, you kind of buried the lead in this book. You told us so much about the founders and Brandeis and Holmes and all of the cases. You got halfway through the book and the second half has an awful lot to do with Donald Trump. So go.
Yeah. But the point I was going to make is that Trump is like McCarthy on steroids. I mean, McCarthy was a junior senator, had not all that much power other than the power of his committee, which he had at his select committee, where he could bring in people, he could subpoena people, and he could accuse people from his perch on the Senate. you have someone in Trump who has the apparatus of the entire executive branch, at his under his thumb, and can do things that are much more harmful. But you also have the prestige of the presidency, and particularly early on, I think that people over the last 3.5 or so years have evolved. And when I say people, I mean press, people in the press, of how they try to cover Trump. Because initially, a lot of the press was reluctant to label Trump's falsehoods as falsehoods. You actually had the then chief editor of the Wall Street Journal, who made an argument that you shouldn't call what the president was doing lies, essentially out of respect for the office itself, which is a betrayal in some sense of what the press should be doing. Even if he is the president, if he's telling lies, you should, out of respect for the office, dance around that. And I think because and we now know, because Trump has a long record. The Washington Post as one of his more popular features is counting the number of lies he's told in any given week or any given period of time. The Globe and Mail has done the same thing about Trump, and some other publications have. There's a little cottage business in keeping track of Trump's lies at this point. So it's changed the way that the press has to cover somebody, and then you have questions raised about to what extent they should cover his public events. If his public events are essentially an occasion to spread falsehoods, which they unfortunately are, even his medical briefings were that, how that should be treated. And the whole question of what kind of deference is given the executive branch, what kind of deference is given the government, has just caused a lot of editors to wrestle with that, and they've made decisions they wouldn't have made about any other president.
It's so interesting because I'm sure he's not the first president who's been accused of lying. I'm sure it's happened from the beginning of the country that there have been such accusations. Is it the frequency and the volume this time that's different?
There have certainly been presidents, if you go to Iran-Contra, and Reagan, if you go to even Obama and the spying that the government did, which began under Bush but continued under Obama, and was brought to light by Ed Snowden. There always are things that politicians have lied about. What differs about Trump is the magnitude of the lies that he tells, his refusal to acknowledge they are lies, his refusal to let other entities of the government acknowledge that these things are lies as well, his insistence that the truth be whatever he defines the truth as. We've never seen anything like the scale of that before. And that has a huge impact, even reaching obviously to this current epidemic and what you can believe about what is coming out of the Centers for Disease Control and other institutions that are under his control. I mean, we've never had a situation where you had before this, where you had to question whether the CDC is issuing facts or issuing misinformation. All of a sudden, under this administration, you have to worry about that. And so it's a matter of magnitude. It's a matter of pervasiveness. And we've just not seen this before. And I think we're trying, and it really does give the lie to this whole idea that truth is necessarily going to drive out lies. If the federal government, which normally would be reasonably well trusted, is the architect of these lies, if the federal government embraces QAnon, and strange theories having to do, with pedophilia and the Democrats and things of that nature, if the federal government is telling you, or at least the chief executive of the executive branch is giving these things credibility, you have a number of people, not surprisingly, who are going to be inclined to believe them. And the question sort of comes up, well, how do you get to truth in the society that has that phenomenon taking place? And I think that's why we've reached what many people consider a crisis in our democracy now. I mean, that's only one aspect of it, but it's an important aspect of it.
I know that Rivka is going to come back in a couple of minutes and ask some questions from the audience, but I have just one or two more. And one of them is on this topic, because you talked early on in talking about President Trump, you mentioned the media and the sort of the sanctity of the office, if not the person. Do you see anything coming up out of this administration, perhaps from this president, that might lead to a court case that would define how the press covers such a situation in the future?
No, it's a short answer, because I think that established law as regards to the press is pretty clear. And I don't think it's anything problematic about what has been decided in terms of law. And I just don't see a court case around that. I mean, there will be and have been cases around freedom of information and what information the executive branch has to provide and how timely it has to be in terms of providing various kinds of information. And I think those will occur, and they occur with any administration. But I think the basic lines of what the press can do are not going to change. I think what is evolving is what the press is deciding it should do. And what the press, and where the press itself draws lines, even as what the press is evolving. I mean, I came up in an era, of course, that was dominated by the networks and newspapers, and we took our role as journalists very seriously, and different than, say, someone with a YouTube channel might take their role as a YouTube personality, but who also performs a lot of the function that the press used to perform, or these various websites.
As influencers.
As influencers, right? Yeah. Exactly. But they are purveying information. Without the talk, there's a lot of talk of guardrails in the federal government. There also were guardrails in the private sector. The guardrails were editors who had a certain set of values that they were imbued with. Where we're now in a moment in our society where much of the information that's circulated is being circulated by institutions or by individuals where there are no guardrails. And it's really up to the consumer to sort of figure out what's truth, what's not, what they believe, what they don't, without the help, or some would say the interference, of an editor.
We do have to do our own fact checking, don't we? And that kind of brings me to an interesting place with your background, because you know journalism, and you know the importance of making sure that there is that fact that you're dealing with, and yet you have the opportunity as an author to not veer away from the truth, but to insert some of your opinion. And you do some of that here. It's factual, but I can also tell it's you
Sure.
giving your. So how does it feel? How do you know when you've gone too far as an author, as a writer, as a journalist? How do you know how far you can go with that before you feel like it's too much?
Well, I think you put your finger on it when you said that there are certain principles of journalism that are inculcated in those, and there's not laws, of course, but they're just guiding ideas that we grew up with within journalism, Donna. And I've spent most of my career not only as a fact journalist, a reporter, but also as an opinion journalist. I mean, I started out as a columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times when I was still a teenager, and for 15 years, I was at Newsweek, and I often wrote cover stories and often wrote basic, what you would call basic journalism, but also wrote an opinion column, which was labeled as such. And whichever hat that I'm wearing, whether it's the hat of more or less objective journalist, reporter, or opinion writer, I still don't print things I know are false. I still try to give people on the other side and the privilege of having their perspective at least shared. And I don't just make up things, And I think that we're in this era now where a lot of content producers are doing all of those things. I mean, they only tell one side. They make up their own facts. And they make accusations without any substance. And I don't think there is any one line. I think it becomes a matter of personal integrity with those of us, who have the privilege of some sort of platform with which to share our views.
You find such fascinating topics to write about, and your passion comes through. I can't imagine too many people writing about these Supreme Court cases and making them as interesting as you make them. You surprised me at several turns with that. Really? Oh my gosh. And I felt myself sort of emanating the same kind of passion that you show for it. So what's next? What will we look forward to next?
Well, actually, I've already signed a contract for another book that'll be coming out next year, and it's essentially a history of America.
Just a tiny topic, huh?
just a tiny topic, but it's a select history of America, and it's called the working title, which I'm sure will change because titles always change, or at least they often change, is From Chattel Slavery to COVID-19, and it's a look at sort of turning point moments in American history.
Will it also have, you can't tell me too much because then somebody else is going to run away with the idea, I understand that, but will it also have the depth of legal issues involved?
Not in the same way that this book does, because this book is largely about the evolution of a legal concept, and how it's played out through society. And certainly the book on ACLU was about an institution that has largely made its mark through legal cases. So this will be more of a general history without as much of emphasis on various court decisions.
And why that topic? Why did you decide to take on something?
Why? I guess because I found myself asking myself over the last 3 years, as a number of people have, how did we get to the point where we ended up with a guy like Donald Trump as president? What have we done as a country to get us here? And decided it would be sort of interesting to just think about that at length.
That's a very interesting question. That's a good place to start. I want you to leave us with not a definition, but a comparison that John A. Powell gave about freedom of speech, like driving a car. Can you explain that?
Yeah, basically, John Powell is a law professor at University of California, Berkeley. He's also, but he's more of a philosopher, I think, than a typical lawyer. And he's one of the more interesting thinkers that I know. And what he talks about a lot, is he's a fervent believer in free speech. He's a fervent believer in the First Amendment. But what he's not a fervent believer in is that it's an absolute right. That yes, you may have a right to drive a car, but you don't necessarily have a right to pollute and ruin other people's lives. And so the question becomes, at what point and how does society mitigate the harms that whatever your right allows you to do, and what can it regulate and what can it not regulate? And his key point is that absolutism is not a guide here, because you don't have an absolute right to anything, including an absolute right to speech. And we don't allow sort of child pornography as speech. We don't allow people to scream, to use the usual examples, scream fire in a crowded theater. We don't allow slander and libel as speech, as protected speech. So there are always, and we could go on for hours about what's regulated. There are always limitations on any rights. And what we're now, I think, confronting in a new way, when we have the evolution of cadres of hate on the internet, and a fostering of sort of a cultural moment where there's a rise of violence from certain sectors and a rise of hatred from certain sectors, is what is the responsible role of various entities and government as well, in making sure that we remain a society that's both free and safe and as equitable as possible.
And that takes us back to the way you started the book. It also comes around again, the Charlottesville situation. as one of many examples, but a very clear example of people expressing something that they feel is very right. They feel they have the right to express themselves as neo-Nazis, wannabe Nazis, or Nazis, however they might be classified, and a lot of other people having a completely different point of view. And that's where that violence and that freedom of speech just collides in itself.
And it's one we wrestle with. It's interestingly, the large part of the definition of what is entitled speech came about through a 1959 court decision involving the KKK, where the KKK was basically allowed to have their rallies because it was decided it was unconstitutional to bar that form of speech. And you mentioned Charlottesville. I mean, the group that defended the Take Back the Right, was the group in Charlottesville. But the group that defended them was the ACLU, because the ACLU has a long-standing principle of defending people who are articulating hate speech. Got into a lot of trouble back in 1978, or I wouldn't say a lot of trouble, but got heavy criticism in 1978 when it defended the neo-Nazis who were marching in a suburb of Chicago called Skokie, which had a lot of, at the time, a lot of survivors of the Holocaust who lived there, and they wanted to schedule a march, and the ACLU defended them and came under very harsh criticism, for doing so. And so it's not a new issue, but it's an issue that is being revisited again in light of some of the trends that we've talked about.
Which just complicates the whole essence. We talked earlier about it being about some naive questions that come up with this, but we have to go back to the fundamental questions of freedom of speech to know where we're going. Speaking of where we're going, look who just showed up. Rivka Satz.
Hey there.
Is
Hi
back
there.
with us to ask some questions from our audience.
Yes, and I hated to interrupt because this is
I know, fascinating.
it's amazing. Thank you. And librarians, this is the foundation of what we are. And I remember Skokie because it was my first library conference, and it was in Chicago, and it was all over the news. I was a student, and it was perfect as a young wannabe librarian. Our first question. Thank you. This was amazing. And Donna, as usual, mwah, the audience is all cheering you. You just can't hear them.
Okay, well, 3 cheers for Donna.
3 cheers for Donna. 3
Only
cheers for
because
you.
You're here, Ellis. Only
Ellis,
because you're here giving fascinating answers.
It's been such a rich conversation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ellis.
And Martin said, and I think he said it really well, thank you for your enlightening, if disturbing, book. Do you see much likelihood for improvement in the next few years, e.g. reversing Citizens United or the Hobby Lobby case? Given the current Supreme Court status, can we have much hope?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, a lot of people are highly disturbed with what is happening with the Supreme Court, and certainly with the way that this last appointment was handled. And I think it would not have been even imaginable that someone would take a position that Biden has taken recently, where he's basically saying, "Hey, look, we need to have a national commission that comes together and looks at the federal judiciary and including the Supreme Court." But I think what has happened particularly under this administration, but over the last several years, it's become very clear that the court has become the sort of captive bipartisan politics, and those are lifetime appointments. There are people who are appointed now that may still be on the Supreme Court 40 years or more, from now. And so the question that I think we really have to wrestle with, is should we as a society be forced to have a Supreme Court into the next generation that doesn't really represent American society anymore? And that's a huge question. And I think that, it's very, and I think this next election is going to determine whether or not we grapple with that question in a serious way or not.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I love the term about being a disturbing book, because it is, and that's what its beauty is. It's the kind of thing that we need to be disturbed about.
Yes. Yes. So that leads to some other questions that are actually very interesting. Kathy wants to know, and I want to find it. How realistic is free speech when it's been proven that foreign entities are able to change the truth in order to influence significant outcomes such as elections?
That's a great question. And I think the only honest answer is that, first of all, I mean, free speech has never been an absolute right in this country or anywhere else. I mean, we have a freer society than most other countries, including most of those in Europe, where they don't even have a First Amendment. But the question of what kind of speech, when you talk about free speech, you're really asking the question of what kind of speech is permitted, and whether the dialogue can be hijacked and should be permitted to be hijacked by foreign actors and by others, who, and also whether speech which has no redeeming social value at all, how you judge what speech is, and what speech should be permitted are big questions that we're going to be, I think, wrestling with for a while now. I mean, and we've been wrestling with these questions in some sense since the beginning. I mean, if you go back even to the beginning of the 20th century, when you had the Palmer raids in the 1920, and you had the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act passed in 1917 and 1918, which prohibited speaking about certain things even back then. I mean, one of my favorites is the guy who who produced a movie called Spirit of 76, which is set in the time of the Revolutionary War. And he thought he was fine because it was, the villains were the Brits. What's wrong with that? Well, the Brits were allies in World War I, and all of a sudden, it's in violation of the Seditions Act, and he ends up getting a 10-year jail sentence for making that movie. And so we are not, I don't think, going to repeat the excesses of World War I, which went a long way towards providing the proof that we needed to grapple with the question of how to make the First Amendment meaningful. But I think we do have all these issues of what kind of speech we permit and how we regulate speech that we think is harmful. And certainly the influence of foreign governments is just flat out illegal. And that becomes a question of what kind of freedom we give our federal entities to try to intercede in that, and to what extent we rely on private actors who are, Facebook and others to be able to recognize this. But it also gets into the whole question of should we look at speech differently when it's on the internet than we look at it when it's in a newspaper?
That's a great point. I have to lighten it up for just a minute because we're coming toward the end. So we want to know what you read for pleasure.
Oh my goodness. Is there any pleasure in the age of COVID?
It depends on what you're reading.
Depends on what you're reading.
Yeah. I find myself actually going back to a lot of the old science fiction that I used to read. I mean, I was just rereading the androids dream of electric sheep, and things like that. I mean, I find myself rereading a lot of that stuff these days.
That I just have to interject for a moment? That was on my bookshelf. I'm not sure how it got there because I had never read it, but there's an unsheltered gentleman in my neighborhood who I often converse with. And I told him I would bring him some books, and he said, well, I really like science fiction. And I took that book to him, and he was so happy because he wanted to reread it. Out of all the books on all the bookcases in all the world, that one was on mine. Thank you for mentioning that. So,
Well, sure. No, it's one of my favorite, but I think it's, and that's the kind of stuff I find myself reading for pleasure these days.
okay, that's good to know. And we have maybe time for one more question, and I'm not sure we can get to it. I think you answered well. Okay, I'm going to ask it. Your title includes The Curious Death of Free Speech in America. Do you think free speech is something we should strive for, or is it something we cling to as a democratic right without really understanding what it is and what it entails? For instance, do we really want QAnon to be able to spread their truth?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. I think what we strive for is definitely free expression and the free interchange of ideas. And so the question becomes, where in the free interchange of ideas do outright falsehoods, conspiracy theories, and things like that belong? And I think that's predicated on a lot of things. But I think going back to the other part of your question about how do we understand free speech? I mean, there was a study, not a study, but a poll, done by Harris about a year ago, which found that as a nation, we really support free speech. I mean, 91% of the respondents said they believe in free speech. 89% of respondents said they believe in a free press. Interestingly, though, 29% of respondents thought that Donald Trump ought to be allowed to shut down CNN or the New York Times if they did things he didn't like. So what that points to, among other things, is at the very least an imperfect understanding of what even free speech and free press means, when you have people on one hand say they believe in it, and the other hand saying the president should be able to shut down press institutions. So I think we do have an incredible amount of ignorance in this country when it comes to just understanding these fundamental rights. And that gets to, I think one of the questions that Donna asked was about why write this kind of book. Part of it is because I think there's a need for education on this issue and for people to be at least have a historical grounding and a legal grounding in what our rights have been and what they are now. But to directly get to things like should QAnon be permitted, I think QAnon should not be unchallenged. And I think ideas like this should not be unchallenged. And I think there definitely needs to be the equivalent of the warning label on cigarettes when stuff like this is circulated. And at the very least, and whether we should take more drastic measures, I think depends on a lot of other things. But at the very least, I think that this should not, such ideas should not be unchallenged.
Thank you. Wonderful answers, wonderful discussion, and we want everyone to buy your book, and we can talk about it. We can keep the conversation going. That's what libraries do, and we can't exist without wonderful authors such as yourself. Donna, great job. Mr. Cose,
thank you, Ellis,
great
for
job.
a wonderful
Ellis,
evening.
Thank you.
Delightful to talk with you.
It's a breath of fresh air at a time when we all need to be reminded that there are thoughtful, smart people out there who want us to think. Perfect discussion. And everybody out there, thank you. We will be posting the recording in the next few days so that you can listen to it again or encourage your friends to listen to this incredible conversation, which would not be possible without all of your participation, without our partners in the publishing world, and of course without amazing authors who provide us with lots of food for thought and naturally our friend Donna Apidone, who asks such wonderful questions. So thank you all so much for coming, and we'll see you again soon. I think our next author is not until December, when Natalie Jenner, author of the Jane Austen Society, will be joining us for virtual tea. So we'll be posting more about that information soon. But Mr. Cose, thank you so much. Donna, thank you.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you, Ellis.
Thank
Have a good
you.
evening, everybody.
Thank you, Donna.
Yeah,
Thank you.
take care, everyone.
Everyone take good care.